walking the serpentine path, following the footsteps of the ancestors, walking the serpentine path, making our way back home. Hey ya, hey, hey ya, ho, hey ya, hey ya, hey ya, ho. Hey ya, hey, hey ya, ho. Following the serpentine path. Life. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Serpentine Path podcast. My name is Claire Wowdy Yassid, and I will be your guide on the serpentine path of life. I'm a songkeeper, plant walker, storyteller, word weaver, artesana, visual and performance artist, daughter, granddaughter, sister, lover, student, and friend, among many, many, many other things. I've spent my life traversing through altered states of consciousness and find it fascinating to explore all the ways in which our modern culture has become almost entirely severed from our innate instinctual and intuitive ability to see beyond the veil of so-called reality. In this podcast, I will be sharing my own personal stories and insights regarding all things related to plant medicine, the birth, death, rebirth cycle, ancestral reconnection, intergenerational healing, womb sovereignty and bodily autonomy, dream work, rites of passage and initiations, time travel, shape-shifting, dimension hopping, and the reclamation of our collective earth-based practices, all of which I consider to be portals into altered states of consciousness. I thank you with my deepest respect and humility for taking the time to open your ears, your minds, and your hearts to what it is that I have to share. The telling of one's story is an intimate and vulnerable experience. It is also, in my opinion, one of the most powerful, illuminating, liberating, and healing medicines that a person can offer to the world. Hearing the cadence in a storyteller's voice, their laughter, their tears, their tone, their pauses, their pain, their joy, their curiosity, and their heart's song is something that can only truly be experienced by way of oral storytelling. Thus, in honoring the storytelling lineages of all of our ancestors, I offer my story to you now. In another world, another time, another dream, we're all sitting together in front of a big fire, passing our visions across the flames and receiving the medicine in our hearts. So again, welcome to the serpentine path where the ancestors have called us back to. Let's start at the end and find our way back home together. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Serpentine Path podcast, or welcome back. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys a little bit about my process and my journey towards motherhood, which, to be clear, I'm not currently pregnant. I have not been pregnant in the past, but as I'm looking at my life and my future and what I'm moving towards within the next few years, I am very committed to starting to build a family and all that comes with that initiation. And so I'm going to be sharing about my process in moving out of my maidenhood and into my motherhood journey. I want to offer a content warning before I get into things because I am going to be talking about some pretty significant birth trauma and medical violence. And so, if you don't currently feel able to hold space for this kind of a conversation, this kind of a story, and you don't feel resourced enough to go through it, I completely understand. And please take care of yourself and be well. But if it is something that you're curious about and you do have the capacity to come back to it at some point, I think that this episode can potentially offer a lot of healing to a lot of people because at this point in time, I'd say pretty much everyone in Western society, modern society, in the United States for sure, has some pretty significant birth violence and birth trauma in their lineage as we have shifted away from birthing at home as just a natural life process into birthing in hospitals as a medical event and more often than not, unfortunately, a medical emergency due to all of the obstetric violence that occurs within the medical system. So I offer this episode to you as a way to hopefully feel some sense of solidarity and camaraderie and understanding that you're not alone in your process if you yourself have potentially gone through a traumatic birth or if the mothers in your family had traumatic births, if you yourself as a baby came into this world in a traumatic or violent way, potentially in a hospital system, then my prayer is that this can be an episode that offers you some companionship in your process of healing. So I'll begin by just sharing the names of the mothers in my family that I'm going to be talking about. So my mother's name is Sarah. She is the daughter of Marnie, who is the daughter of Texas, who was the daughter of Martha. So I guess to begin, I'll just share, I'm the oldest daughter out of 3 daughters in my family. My mom was also the oldest daughter out of 3 children. My grandmother was the oldest daughter of 2 children, and my great grandmother, all on my mother's side, was the oldest daughter of 5 children. So the strong lineage to come from. I'm sure that all of the oldest daughters out there can empathize and understand what it is to be an oldest daughter. And as an oldest daughter, you're also kind of like little mom, little mother. And I really did feel that throughout my entire life and still do as the oldest daughter, that weight and that responsibility. And, as the oldest daughter, I also had the responsibility of taking care of my sisters a lot of the time, even still in ways. And I was also the oldest in my entire family. So I'm the first grandchild on both sides of the family. And also growing up, I was the oldest child in a neighborhood full of tons of children, all under the age of like 5. Like almost every single house in the neighborhood had 2 or 3 children, all under the age of 5. And so I became the neighborhood babysitter. There were maybe 1 or 2 other kids who were like as old as me or potentially a little bit older who were available to babysit. And so I became the village babysitter. Sorry, not village babysitter, neighborhood babysitter. I did not grow up in a village. I became the neighborhood babysitter. And I loved babysitting. I loved spending time with kids. I loved all of the funny and crazy things that they said. I loved the cute little things that they did, even when they had like, temper tantrums and kind of dramatic child moments that are totally normal and actually a sign of like a child moving through their own individuation process and all of that. I even loved that part of it, and I loved going to their houses and eating all their good food and, bath time, playing with all of the toys and putting kids to bed. And I would always sing them to sleep. And I loved taking care of kids. And it was funny because whenever my parents would see other parents out, like at the store or at kind of community events or just walking around the neighborhood, they would always say to my parents, "Oh my God, how's Claire? The kids ask about her all the time." They only want her to come and babysit. When we say that there's another babysitter coming over, they like throw a fit, like, oh, they just love Claire. And I remember at some point my mom asked me, she was like, what are you doing with these kids that they are so obsessed with you? And I said to her, I said, I sing to them. She's like, what? And I was like, when we're going to bed, I sing them a lot of lullabies. I sing them all the lullabies that you would sing to me. And so I just sing to them for a long time, sometimes like almost an entire hour before bedtime. That's how I can get them into bed like earlier because they love hearing me sing. And so I did childcare from probably, yeah, like ages like 9 or 10 until all the way up through, yeah, through college. I babysat a little bit in college, but it was also a totally different ball game. Babysitting children and families in New York City was like really, really intense, because the children spent zero time outside. They were so profoundly overstimulated. They were glued to screens. They were living in these tiny little apartments, and the parents were really, really intense. And I was like, this is not what I am going to sign up for. Like, this kind of a family dynamic, this kind of an intensity with the parents, these kinds of children who are like very clearly really suffering due to a lack of connection just to nature. I just don't want to do this. And so I stopped doing a lot of childcare when I moved to New York City. But I love, 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 love kids. And I also always just knew that I was going to become a mother. It wasn't even something that I was like, oh, one day I really want to be a mom. It was just like I knew in my bones, like, oh, yeah, like I'm going to be a mom one day. Like it's not even a question. That's just part of my life path. And that all started to pretty drastically shift when I got into my, let's see, early 20s was when it first kind of started. And that was because on my 22nd birthday, I did this psychic reading with this woman. And she said to me something really interesting and actually really beautiful now when I look back on it. If I had received this reading at the age that I am now at 28, I would have been like, wow, that's incredible. Thank you. But I was 22 at the time, and this woman said to me, you have no idea how powerful you are, and your power is really going to come online when you step into motherhood. And again, I was 22 and I was like, what are you talking about? I want to know about my career as like a professional dancer and a professional performance artist and blah, blah, blah. And I had just, those were my priorities at the time. And I had a lot of ego and I couldn't give a shit about like power through motherhood. I was like, what are you talking about? And she kept going on and on and on about it. And I was getting frustrated. And then at a certain point, she said something pretty crazy, which was that she said, you're going to be stepping into motherhood within the next year or two. And again, I was 22 and I had a full blown panic attack in this moment. I was like, what are you talking about? I'm 22 years old. I have literally no money. I'm going month to month just to scrape by, like with rent and food and my Metro card to get to my crazy side jobs that I work. I worked like 4 jobs at one time. There's no way in hell that I can afford to have a child. And two, I'm in a relationship with an extremely abusive person who I would never, ever want to have children with and create a family with. Like, that is not my life path. And there's no way in hell that I'm going to be doing that. And so I had this like full blown panic attack, and this psychic chica was like, okay, let's rearrange the karmic contract and the timelines and la la la. And so she did that, apparently. And I'm actually really, really grateful for that moment, because in that moment with my first child's spirit coming through to me, because she was translating messages from this first child, this child basically came to me and was like, I'm coming at some point and you need to align your life so that the family that we're going to be creating together is going to be the family that we want to have. And so this was in June. My birthday is at the end of June. And for the next 4 months, I pretty much went through this process of having to be like, okay, I'm in a pretty abusive relationship. I'm very unhappy with what's going on in my life. And if I don't make any changes, that's how my life is just going to continue forward. And so my child coming to me at that moment in time was actually a huge catalyst for my ability to leave my abusive relationship. And I'm going to do a whole episode about leaving that relationship and everything that happened during that process and after that process and the impact that it had on my life, because it was a profound chapter of my life. It was not just that single event, but like lots of ripples afterwards. But it was a big reason why I was able to get the courage to leave finally and the strength to leave. And it was because of my future child. But so one of the ripples that occurred after leaving my abusive relationship was that I became absolutely terrified of having any kind of a monogamous relationship with a man, long-term monogamous relationship with a man, because my experience had been so profoundly traumatizing for those 5 years. And that was my first serious relationship. That was kind of like my blueprint for what relationships between men and women look like in a heterosexual dynamic. And so I was really adamant of like, I will not be doing monogamy. I will not be doing heterosexuality or heteronormativity. I got deeper and deeper into a lot of queer theory and kind of gender theory and all of that. And I was really pushing against womanhood, which I've talked a little bit about how I struggled a lot with my gender since I was a child. But throughout my 20s, gender was just like more and more and more and more painful for me. And I'm going to do a whole episode dedicated to my gender journey because it has been really fascinating and really enlightening. But essentially, I just absolutely hated the concept of womanhood. I hated the fact that I had a woman's body. I hated the fact that I bled every month and that I had hormones and that I had to go through the process of being a woman, essentially. And so I was really fighting against womanhood and saying, like, I'm gender fluid, I'm non binary, I'm trans, I'm anything but woman. And it's not that I necessarily wanted to be a man, because I wasn't ever someone who took any kind of medicalization steps towards transitioning. I never took any hormones. I never did any kind of surgeries to change my physical appearance, but I was just so violently against womanhood. And there's a lot of reasons for that, most of that being a lot of sexual abuse that I had experienced throughout my life since I was a child. And also, a lot of that had to do with this relationship that I had had where the dynamic between men and women, I was like, I will not do that. If that is what it means to be a woman in a relationship with a man, I will not be participating in that. And so instead of trying to find a different way to relate to men, and instead of making a very strong commitment to just not tolerate that kind of behavior in men, my way of coping was to say, okay, well, then I'm just not a woman. And so I was severely, severely detached from anything having to do with womanhood, anything having to do with fertility, anything having to do with the creation of life in my body. And I was really suffering. I was in a lot of pain. I was dealing with a lot of hormonal and reproductive health issues, a lot of infections, just a whole plethora of stuff, which I'm going to go more in depth in the future, in a future episode. But basically, I was like in this place where I was like, cool, I'm not a woman. I will never be having a monogamous relationship again. I went really deep into like non-monogamy and polyamory, relationship anarchy, blah, blah, blah. I was really adamant about that for a long time. And I also got to a point where I was like, and I will not be having kids, which I know was extremely, extremely painful for my mother to hear me say to her when I said, I will not be giving you grandchildren. And it was extremely painful for me to say to myself that I did not want children. And there were a lot of reasons that I came to that decision. There was a lot of shame that I was dealing with, a lot of guilt, a profound degree of trauma, and just so much confusion around what it was to be a woman, which was something that I did not want to do. So when I started my path with Jahe, I was 24 years old. And I remember in one of my very first ceremonies in the jungle, I just heard the word woman over and over and over again in my head. And it was really uncomfortable and really painful, and I just kind of squashed it down. But moving forward, it kind of continued to happen. And I also ended up taking my IUD out when I started my path with Jahe. So when I came back from the jungle that first time, I immediately went to the gynecologist and I got my copper IUD taken out. And basically, I had been given the assignment in ceremony to figure out how to manage my fertility without any kind of hormones or any kind of medical devices inside of me. And that's what I've been doing over the past, I guess, 3.5 years, is doing a lot of deep womb healing work. So that slowly began my process of coming back to my womb and slowly opening the door for motherhood to be a possibility. So fast forward to March 2022, when I met my late and beloved teacher, Abuelo Kerawin, for the first time. And I was in a different part of the jungle. I was in Bajo Putumayo at his home. And the very first ceremony that I did with Abuelo was really small. It was just Abuelo, my partner Vincent, who we were not partners at that moment in time, but we did have kind of a story, a romantic story going on. And then another curandero, a younger guy, and then 2 patients from Ecuador who had come to do healings with Abuelo. So it was just 6 of us, and we were on Abuelo's porch. And I went up to go take my cup of medicine, and when I took my cup, I drank and I went and I sat down and I spoke to the plant, the spirit of the plant, and I said, okay, why am I here? I made my way all the way to this jungle. I'm with this 110-year-old shaman. I'm the only white girl in this jungle. I'm living with this man, Vincent, my current partner, who, I fell in love with a few months ago, but I haven't heard anything from him since. And somehow he ended up being here in the jungle without me knowing, and our paths have crossed again. And so, what is the point of all of this? Why am I here? What is my spiritual path? And how can I be of service to humanity? What is my work in this life? And how can I commit myself to this work? What is it? And so I'm sitting there meditating and I'm asking this question. And for those who might not be familiar with the medicine of Jahe, the medicine of ayahuasca, it really depends the effects. Sometimes you can start feeling it really, really quickly. Like I've taken a cup and started feeling the medicine within 2 minutes. But then I've also taken cups where it takes me like an hour or 2 hours to feel anything. And so I'm just waiting. And pretty quickly I start feeling the effects of the medicine, and I'm asking this question over and over again. What is my path of service in this life? And what is going to be the most important aspect of my spiritual evolution moving forward? And I was asking this question, and very quickly, the spirit of the plant came to me and said just one word, which was motherhood. And I was super confused. I was like, what do you mean I have to heal with my mother? And the plant said, yeah, that's a start, but no, I mean literal motherhood. I mean you literally becoming a mother. And I was shocked. I was like, sorry, you got the wrong one. Not me. I'm not doing this. I've decided kids are off the table. That's not my life. That's not who I am. I'm not interested. Give me another spiritual mission. I was like, And the plant just came back at me and it was like, no, motherhood. That's it. That's what you're doing. And I was like, no, that's not what I'm doing, because I don't have a partner and I don't have any interest and I just don't want to do it. And I was fighting really hard. And the plant was like, okay, well, you don't want to do it. Okay, well, here's your kids. And the spirits of my future children arrived to me one by one. And I looked at them, and they were the most beautiful little beings in the world. And they started sharing all about themselves with me and their lives and their journeys and their paths and their little souls and their little spirits and everything that they wanted to experience in their future lives and what they were doing on the other side and everything that they had witnessed me go through and all of this. And I was just like, oh my God, look at you, precious little beings. I love you so much. Hi. But again, I was like, no, 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 I don't have a partner and it's just not happening. And over the next probably 6 ceremonies, I would say, it was just time and time and time and time again, my children coming to me and being like, hi, mom, and just pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing for me to get this through my thick skull that like motherhood was my work. It was where my deepest healing was going to be. And it was really important that I got on board with this soul's mission. It was just like, you got to do this. And so I finally accepted after like a few weeks of just really suffering with this information. And life went on, and I moved through this process of being like, okay, well, then what is it that I have to do in order to make space for motherhood in my life? And one of the big things that came up was a lot of cleaning around my sexuality. So, as I've said, I have experienced a lot of sexual abuse in my life, unfortunately. And I had to go through a big, big, big process of cleaning all of that. And I'm going to do a future episode all about that. But that was the beginning of my process, was getting into right relationship with my body again and getting into right relationship with sexuality again and understanding that in order to create a life and to create a child, obviously I'm going to be sharing sexual intimacy with the father of that child, and how to come into right relationship with the kind of sexual intimacy that I wanted to be sharing, and what kind of energy I would want me and my partner to be participating in when we are creating that life in the future. And so I had to go through this huge, huge process of essentially unlearning everything that I had learned about sex since I was very, very young. This huge process of cleaning and cleaning and cleaning and deprogramming and unlearning and coming back into connection with what healthy sexuality actually was. And this was a process that took years. Like, seriously, I would say a year and a half to like 2 years of really, really deep work that I'll talk about more in another episode. So that was the first part, was cleaning everything about my sexual history, going through offering so much softness and forgiveness to myself, softness and forgiveness to a lot of people who had treated my body really badly within a sexual context, and really just finding peace in my body. So that was the first part. After all of that, kind of towards the tail end of like the really, really deep sexual healing work, then came this really important phase of going through all of the birth trauma in my lineage. So I'm gonna begin first with my, let's see, great grandmother, Texas. So my great grandmother, Texas, when she gave birth to my grandmother, I guess my grandma was born in like 1938 or 39. I don't exactly remember, but when she gave birth to my grandmother, she was taken to the hospital. And this was during the twilight sleep era of hospital births, for those of you who are familiar with it. For those of you who are not, essentially what happened during this time period in the United States, which was a pretty big chunk of time, was that birthing mothers were taken into hospitals and they were given medication, sometimes something as strong as ether, and sometimes things more like Demerol and I don't know, other medications that essentially knock you unconscious and or like semi-conscious. And then they give you Pitocin, which is a synthetic version of the natural hormone oxytocin, which naturally begins the contractions that lead to labor and birth. And then also like an epidural to just kind of completely numb that part of your body. So my grandmother was given multiple medications and was completely knocked out, unconscious. And while she was unconscious, the doctors went in with forceps and they pulled my grandmother out. And my great grandmother, Texas, woke up a few days later after having been drugged and having had her baby ripped out of her. And her baby was in a little, kind of box or bassinet beside the bed. And she had already been bottle fed. So not only did my grandmother not get to have the initiatory experience of moving through the birth portal and calling her daughter's spirit into this world and walking with her through that portal of life because she had been knocked out and because the baby had been ripped out of her, but she also missed those first very precious few days of bonding with her baby, breastfeeding her baby, looking at her baby's face, seeing her baby's eyes, her little toes, her little hands, feeling her heartbeat and her breathing. My great grandmother did not get that. She was pregnant in one moment, and then she woke up a few days later, and a baby was there beside her, and she was not really allowed to spend much time with the baby. She was not allowed to breastfeed the baby. She was not allowed to co-sleep with the baby in her bed. And this created pretty severe dysfunction between my great grandmother Texas and my grandmother Marnie. My grandmother Marnie had a really, really complicated relationship with her mother, and also I would say a pretty violent and abusive relationship in a lot of ways. My great grandmother Texas was profoundly unkind to her children. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But for me, when I see this, I say, well, yeah, of course, there was really painful dynamics between mother and baby and her children as they grew up. She did not receive those sacred moments of knowing her power as a birthing mother, going through that process of bringing life into this world, feeling her body capable of being the portal for that life to enter, and being able then to be the one, the first one to pick up her baby, the first one to touch her baby, to look into her baby's eyes, to be the first one to see her baby breathe and scream and laugh and smile and cough and look around at the world. She did not get to breastfeed her own child, which is basically what helps bond a mother with their baby, right? The hormones that are produced when you're breastfeeding are oxytocin and prolactin. Oxytocin is also the same hormone that we release during orgasm, during sexual intimacy with our partners, that creates bonding with our partnership. It's the same thing when we're breastfeeding, that oxytocin that's released, and we look down and we see our little baby and they have the nipple in their mouth and they're looking up at us with their beautiful little eyes. My grandmother did not get to do that. That was taken from her, and she was forced to bottle feed her baby. And so, yeah, obviously, she resented motherhood. Obviously, she never found her footing with it. obviously there was no way that she was going to be able to create a healthy relationship with my grandmother or with my great uncle, who I believe she probably had the same kind of a birth with him. There was also no understanding that this kind of a birth is so profoundly unnatural and violent and horrible. And so she didn't have any support. She didn't have anyone to talk to about this. She didn't have anyone to do like a birth trauma debrief with. There was no therapy for this. There were no support groups, nothing. My great grandma suffered and she did not get initiated into motherhood. She was apparently a mother, but she didn't actually go through that spiritual process of coming into her power. That power was taken from her. And so that, as I said, created a really, really painful dynamic between my grandma and my great grandma, between mothers and daughters. And thankfully, by the end of my great grandma's life, my grandma was able to come to peace with her mother. And they came to a really good place and a lot of deep forgiveness and understanding. But for my grandma's entire life, her relationship with her mother was so fractured and so violent and so devoid of true nurturance and care, love, because of that moment of initiation that was stolen from both of them. As a small baby, not actually having a secure attachment bond with your own mother, and as a mother, not having any idea how to attach and how to bond with your child, because those really sacred and precious moments were stolen from you. That was my grandmother's, my great grandmother's birth with my grandmother. And I had kind of heard parts of this story before, but my mom was the one who shared this with me. So then after that, I asked my mom about my grandmother's birth with my mother. And again, it was a really violent hospital birth where my grandmother went in to the hospital and she was given, I believe it was an epidural, but also some other medication. And also, to be clear, the majority of the time, epidurals have like full-on fentanyl in them, which not only goes obviously into the mother's bloodstream, but into the baby's bloodstream. And so we're giving babies fentanyl in the birthing process. I learned this very recently. I was horrified to understand that we were drugging babies with fentanyl as they were being born, but that's a story for another day. So anyway, they gave my grandma very strong painkillers. She was completely numb. She couldn't feel anything going on, which my grandma did not want. My grandma wanted the full experience of giving birth. She was coerced into this in the hospital through a lot of different medical terms that were thrown around at her and blah, 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 a bunch of manipulation. My grandma did not want this, but she was forced into having epidurals and different medications. And my mother was not coming down. And so, again, they went in and did a forceps birth. Now, I want to really touch on something here, which is that when we're thinking about both my great grandmother and my grandmother's birth and forceps being entered into their body, particularly my great grandmother, who was quite literally unconscious, I don't think that she had any idea that they were going to be entering into her body with metal tools into her vagina and ripping her baby out of her. Again, unconscious, being penetrated with medical tools without her consent. That is the definition of rape. And I'm not even going to label it as like medical rape. That is just rape in my vision. And I see that in the same way with my grandmother, in that my grandmother wanted to have a natural, unmedicated vaginal birth. She was manipulated and coerced into all of these interventions that she did not want. And at a certain point, she was forced to have a forceps birth, which a forceps birth is forcibly entering into a mother's vagina with metal tools and ripping a baby out of her, which is a very, very dangerous procedure. There are babies that literally get fully decapitated in this kind of a procedure. It is not a chill thing to be doing. And so my grandmother suffered such profound, severe trauma from this birth, both very serious physical and medical trauma, as well as profound, profound emotional trauma. And my mother did as well as a little baby. My mother, as a baby, was just crying and crying and crying and crying and crying and crying pretty non-stop. And what I've learned recently in a lot of my self-education in the realm of pre and perinatal psychology is that a lot of the time babies and children who go through really intense phases of severe, severe crying, there's two different versions of crying that babies experience. One is a needs cry. That's going to be like, I need to eat, I need to sleep, I need to go to the bathroom, or I'm too hot or too cold. Or, I need like physical attention and affection and touch from my caregiver, my parent, my mother, my father, whoever's looking after me. So that's a needs cry. And generally speaking, when a baby's needs are all met, they stop crying, generally speaking. Then there's release crying that babies do when they are attempting to release any kind of stresses or trauma that they have experienced during the day, any kind of stresses or trauma that they are sensing within the family constellation, but also birth trauma, because birth trauma does not just occur to the mother. The baby, when the baby is coming into this life, if their very first moments are ones of force and pretty violent medical manipulation and a lot of drugs, that is not how babies are meant to be coming into this world. That is such a profoundly shocking and disorienting and painful entry into this life. And so babies will cry and cry and cry, and they'll also do certain things like repetitive body movements, like they'll pull at their ears, or they'll try to like hit their head on things, and that's them almost recreating the birth imprint of a moment during the birth when they were unable to move through the birth canal. If they got stuck, if there was something that was going on, the baby will recreate that moment. Or let's say like the baby had to be turned, like the baby will try to make those body movements, right? Because they're trying to somatically release the trauma that they're still holding in their body. And so babies will cry and cry and cry and cry and cry. And that's what happened with my mom. My mom just cried and cried and cried and cried and cried. And nothing that my grandma did could get my mother to calm down. One of the differences was that my grandma did breastfeed my mother. I'm not sure for how long, maybe at least a year, which is great. I mean, ideally you would do it for at least 2 years, potentially longer, but she did breastfeed my mom for a pretty significant amount of time. And she didn't bottle feed my mother. But what I also saw happen to my grandmother was that, well, two things. One, after this, my grandma was like, that experience will never happen again. I will not be repeating that, because what also happened to her was that the drugs that they had given her for the epidural were so, so strong that for almost an entire week, she couldn't feel that part of her body. It was very hard for her to walk. She almost couldn't walk. And she could not even contract her own bowels in order to go to the bathroom and pass feces. And so my grandfather, and this is kind of graphic, but this is what happened. My grandfather had to go in with his hands into her rectum and scoop the feces out of her body. And so when I imagine my grandmother as a new mother with a brand new baby that is crying nonstop, literally unable to walk and move around, and not even capable of going to the bathroom because of what happened to her at the hospital, and having her husband have to go into her body and scoop it out like that. I mean, my God, that is not the kind of initiation into motherhood that anybody would want. And so my grandma, to her credit, took a lot of responsibility and was like, that will never happen again. And in her next two births, she got really deep into Lamaze. She was all excited about Lamaze, and she took her Lamaze classes, and she showed up at the hospital and she said, you will not be medicating me, you will not be touching me, you will not be coaching me and telling me what to do. I will be having my own births. I have trained for this. My grandma was like a freaking warrior. She's like, I am trained, get out of my way, right? The fact that she was able to do that in like the 60s with the births of my uncle and my aunt is pretty remarkable, and that is not really allowed in hospitals at this point in time. There are much more coercive behaviors that occur now. But my grandma was like, absolutely the fuck not. I will not be doing that again. You won't be giving me a single goddamn medication. You won't be ripping my babies out with forceps. Absolutely not. And so my grandma was able to reclaim her power in her next two births. However, my grandma also suffered from some pretty severe urinary tract health issues throughout her life, and it got worse and worse and worse as she got older. And a huge reason for that was because with the forceps birth, they had done pretty severe damage to my grandmother's urethral tract, which, was right there with the uterus, and some pretty severe damage to just her entire pelvic bowl. And so as my grandmother got older, she had some very severe issues with her bladder and with her urethra. She got a lot of UTIs and she was in a lot of pain. And my grandma eventually ended up dying from bladder cancer. And so in a lot of my ceremonies, I too have dealt with a lot of urinary tract infections in my life, and like really, really bad ones, like horrible. I was doing a lot of work with vaginal infections, and I was doing a lot of work specifically like with the bladder and with the urethra and everything. And I was remembering that that was something that my grandma really struggled with as well. I would be in ceremony and I would be meditating and I would be asking the plant to help me untangle and unravel this trauma that had been passed down into my body from my grandmother. And when my grandmother ended up getting diagnosed with bladder cancer, I was like, okay, what is the spiritual root of this physical illness? Because I'm a person that believes that all illness in the body, whether it's physical or mental illness, comes from some form of either individual or collective trauma at the spiritual level. So what is the spiritual trauma that is manifesting as bladder cancer for my grandma? And what I saw was the profound violence of that medical rape that occurred, and what my grandmother held onto in her body: the pain, the fear, the loss of her autonomy, the initiation into motherhood being stolen from her during such a highly medicalized and violent birth, all of the repair that had to occur between her and her first daughter in those first few months and first few years, all of that. And also the literal physical violence that occurred by shoving a metal object into a birthing mother's body when she is so tender and exposed and wide open and in the middle of contractions and doing probably the most sacred and powerful act that a woman's body is capable of doing, which is bringing life into this world. She was raped in that moment. And so the attachment to that pain is what manifested eventually as bladder cancer for my grandmother. I'm gonna just take a breath because, like, it's intense, y'all. It's a lot. Oof. So then after that, I was talking a lot with my mother about my own birth. And my birth with my mom occurred when My mother went in for a checkup at the doctor's office, a prenatal visit. And it's important to note here that me and all of the women in my mom's family all have kind of longer cycles. We usually cycle for like somewhere between like 30 and 35 days. And so our periods can sometimes be as long as like our menstrual cycles can be sometimes as long as like 35 days, 5 weeks, instead of the typical 4 weeks. So the medical industrial complex and just female reproductive health, quote unquote, experts, professionals, blah, 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 really don't understand how drastically a woman's cycle can fluctuate. And that it can actually, within a normal range, can go from anywhere between 24 days to 38 days. And so when they are determining the date of gestation and like the quote unquote due date, when they're estimating that, they're assuming that the woman doesn't know actually when she herself ovulates, and they count it from the day of your last period before you got pregnant. So, to give just like a very quick kind of fertility lesson, you become pregnant during ovulation. That's when like an egg and a sperm are actually available to meet one another, and implantation occurs over the next few weeks. So if we were to track the day of conception, it does not begin the first day of your last period before you got pregnant. You're literally bleeding. There's no egg in there, there's no sperm in there, no one's meeting, no one is hanging out and hooking up. It's not possible until you ovulate. So conception does not occur until ovulation occurs. So for my mother, she ovulated usually pretty late. She ovulated around like between 18 and 21 days, not 14 days. So my mom's ovulation date was like a full week behind most people's ovulation date. So when she went into the doctor, doctors had no idea how to accurately calculate the day of conception. It's ridiculous to me that they don't, but they had no idea how to actually calculate that. And so when they did my ultrasound, which I take a lot of issue with ultrasound, that's a conversation for another day as well. They did the ultrasound and they said to my mother, "You're 39 or 40 weeks pregnant," which isn't true. I was only probably actually like 36 or 37 weeks. I could have gone much later, naturally. And they said, "We have to induce you because your baby is failing to thrive." And it's like at the moment where that it has to happen because 39 weeks, whatever their like bullshit justification was to force my mother to induce. And my mom was like, I don't feel that that is true. I think my baby's fine. I think that I'm fine. And I think that we could go a little later. And they were like, "No, we have to do it for the health of you, for the health of the baby. We have to induce." And there was a lot of fear mongering and manipulation. And my mother did not know any better. And she was like, "Okay, I guess that's what we're doing." And so my mother was induced, which an induction is when they put you on Pitocin, which again, Pitocin is a synthetic hormone that copies oxytocin. Now, when we're looking at the hormonal matrix that leads into birth, oxytocin is what is going to be released in the body to begin those contractions. There's, of course, a lot of other hormones that are involved, a lot of other chemicals that are involved in the body, but oxytocin is the main one. Now, when a birth is allowed to take its natural physiologic course, the contractions that occur are going to be slow but steady, and they're going to gradually increase in intensity. And with each one of those contractions, the woman and the baby, the mother and the baby, are both getting used to the sensations and slowly being able to produce enough oxytocin, which is also a pain-killing hormone, that kind of acclimates them to the intensity of the contractions, right? Now, when you take Pitocin, Pitocin pretty much kicks you off into labor. It takes you from 0 to 100 in a millisecond, right? And so my mother was given Pitocin, and boom, she got a contraction that was like a big kind of kick in the ass and a slap in the face. And she was like, holy fucking shit. I cannot do this. Is this a joke? This is birth? Oh my God. And so my mom, after just a little bit of time, eventually got an epidural, which something that happens with an epidural is that it essentially cuts off communication between the mother and the baby, because when you don't have an epidural and you're able to feel everything that's going on, the mother can track where the baby is in her body and how low she's getting and what's going on and how much she's opening up. And there's a communication between the mom and the baby. The baby's like, all right, mom, now I'm doing this. All right, now I'm doing that. And mom's like, okay, baby, and now we're doing this and now we're doing that. And there's a communication. When you do an epidural, you sever that connection. And so baby actually feels completely abandoned in that moment. And baby's like, mom, hello, mom, what's going on? Mom, hi, are you here? And mom doesn't actually know where baby is moving because mom can't feel anything. And so when I look at my relationship between my mother and a lot of avoidant tendencies that I have with my mom and a lot of abandonment issues that I have with my mom, so much of that I can attribute to that moment in birth with the epidural, where we were doing this thing together, where we were both forced into a birth that we were not yet ready for. And then in that forcing, we were then separated and severed our connection. And so I didn't actually feel like I had my mother there doing it with me. And again, I do not blame my mom at all in any of this by any means. I'm not upset with my mom or angry at my mom at all. She did not know better, and she was just doing what she thought was best for her baby's health and her baby's life, because that's the way that the medical industry positions all of these unnecessary interventions, right? So I came into the world, and again, what happens whenever any baby is born is that my father was not the one that got to catch me when I came out. And my mother was not the one that got to catch me when I came out. A doctor, a complete stranger, someone who is not responsible for my health or well-being once I leave that hospital, someone who does not watch me grow up, someone who does not feed me and care for me and nourish me and nurture me, but truly just a stranger with gloves and a mask and scrubs, caught me and immediately severed my cord, which is extremely problematic. Babies should maintain connection to the placenta until the placenta comes out, is birthed. Due to a lot of reasons, it's actually better for the health of the baby and for the mother if the cord is not cut for until the placenta comes out, actually, which can take some time, sometimes a few hours naturally. The body is not going to birth the placenta immediately. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But so my cord was cut immediately. I was taken away. I was washed, which is also problematic. You're supposed to leave all of the, I believe it's called vernix, on the baby's skin. It's really good for their skin. It's good for their immune system. And then I was bundled all up, and then I was given to my mother. And so the first people to touch me were not my father and were not my mother, but were strangers. And my mother did not get to be the first one to hold her own baby. And so thankfully, I did breastfeed with my mom. And in the beginning, I did co-sleep with my parents, and my mom was available to be home with me for, I believe, 3 months. But my father was not around. My father did not get time off from work, which I think is profoundly tragic that we don't have extended parental leave for both mothers and fathers, because I think about how much of the bonding time that I missed out on with my dad and the bonding time that my dad missed out on with his very first child. And my mom was completely alone in the beginning. I believe that my grandma came to look after her for a little bit of time. Potentially, maybe there were other people around for like a week or two. But then after that, my mom was completely alone with me, which new mothers should never, ever, ever be left alone. ever. It's profound to me, this concept that we have now at this moment in time of leaving new mothers completely abandoned with no one around to help them with cooking, to help them with cleaning, to help them with the new life that they just brought in, to give them time to be able to take a shower, to take care of them and their healing, because postpartum is an extremely important time for healing. It's why so many women struggle with a lot of issues with their pelvic floor function, because they're expected to be up and moving around and doing a lot of either domestic labor or work outside of the home while their body is still healing. Mothers should have at least 6 to 8 weeks where they're just in bed resting and everyone is just cooking for them, washing clothes for them, cleaning the house for them, helping take care of the baby, focusing on their healing. So my mom did not have that, obviously, and pretty much no mothers do at this point in time, unless you are lucky enough to be able to hire like a postpartum doula or, a nanny, or you have family around that's able to do that with you. But so my mom and I were just alone. And then after that, when my mom went back to work after only 3 months, I was sleep trained in the cry it out method, which was a very common method and is still used. And I pray to God that at some point in time it completely dies out, because what I recently learned about sleep training is that when, first of all, you can't sleep train a baby. Babies need like 3 to 15 hours of sleep, newborn babies, every single day. Most babies are like severely sleep deprived, actually, which is why so many of them cry a lot, because they just want to sleep and they want to sleep on their own schedule. So babies still don't have any kind of circadian rhythm. They don't really understand day and night yet. And they just sleep when they sleep and they wake up when they wake up. Generally speaking, a baby, if you're co-sleeping with it and it's moving around in the bed and you just need to give it a little bit of a touch or a little bit of a quiet voice or sometimes to feed, and it'll go back to sleep. But it doesn't have to make a lot of noise to get its needs met, because it's right there next to its mom. When you sleep train a baby outside of your room and put it in a nursery, it means that the baby has to cry or scream really loud in order to get your attention, in order to get the needs met. And with sleep training, when you do like a cry it out method, where you're basically trying to teach a baby to quote unquote self-soothe, it to me is one of the most torturous and inhumane things that we can do to both children and mothers, because babies and mothers actually need one another to co-regulate for the entire 9 months of exogestation that occur after a baby is born. A baby cannot self-regulate its own breathing rate. A baby cannot regulate its own body temperature. A baby cannot regulate its own heart rate. A baby needs to be in close physical contact, primarily with its birth mother or with a father or a caregiver. And when I say close contact, I mean like within arm's reach at all times, truly at all times, because that is how a baby learns how to co-regulate through our own bodies. So what happens when you do cry it out is the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system basically like shift into severe survival mode, where they start producing these intense stress hormones. And in a little baby, what will happen, let's say in the wild, if a baby gets abandoned, the baby will cry and cry and cry and cry and cry and cry and cry. And there will be these stress hormones that are produced in the baby's mind that essentially, at some point, knock the baby out. The baby completely knocks out and goes unconscious as a survival mechanism to not get eaten and call like a predator over to it through its crying. And when it knocks out, it goes unconscious, the baby, and it actually creates brain damage. It like kills brain cells. When a baby gets to that point where the stress hormones are so high, the stress hormone of cortisol is so high that a baby goes unconscious, it quite literally creates brain damage. And on top of that, it creates a very dysfunctional, secure attachment, or actually insecure attachment between mother and baby, or baby and caretaker, whoever is not available to pick them up. And so babies then learn that their needs will not get met. And so they then learn to stop communicating their needs, to stop trusting any of their caretakers. And it has a profound and severe impact on the way in which babies and then children and then teenagers and then grown adults end up being able to interact with their loved ones, starting first with that very sacred primal bond between mother and baby. And so that also then has an impact on the mother, because mothers need the baby in close proximity to co-regulate their nervous systems. And so we have then all of these mothers who are entirely dysregulated and who are not able to create a very strong, secure bond with their own babies, which then creates a lot of hypervigilance and fear and trauma within a mother's body and a mother's nervous system, which I feel very deeply is something that definitely happened to my mom and me when we were in those early years. So I went through this whole process of first my great grandmother's birth, my grandmother's birth, and my mother's birth with me, and seeing all of the medical violence and coercion and rape and trauma and pain and suffering that was created as all of the mothers in my lineage were brought into their mothering years. And also the pain and violence and trauma that was created at the very beginning of a new family constellation. And also the violence that occurred to the husbands in these situations who were either watching their wives be knocked out or be given different medications, be manipulated and coerced by doctors, having that sacred role taken from them of being able to catch their own baby and not being able to advocate for their wives. A lot of the time, husbands were not even allowed into the birth room with their own wives and their own babies. And so I think about the detachment that occurs when a father is either witnessing a lot of birth violence or isn't witnessing birth violence but knows in their spirit that something really bad went down in that hospital room. And I'm just seeing how it rips families apart from the very beginning, from the moment that the family is created, that moment of birth, that first breath. The family is already tainted with profound medical violence, and oftentimes, more than not, medical rape. I think it's important to note that I recently read this book called Childbearing Wisdom from the World's Oldest Traditions, or Oldest Societies, something like that. And in that book, they talk about all of the birthing practices from a lot of different intact lineages around the world. And the researchers asked all of these people, during a birth, if something is going on with the baby or with the mother, do you ever enter into the mother by way of her vagina in order to change or transform things or flip the baby or whatever? And every single time that they asked, every single culture said, absolutely not. We would never put our hands inside of a birthing mother. Ever. There's other massage techniques that we have for external manipulation, the mother's belly and the baby. And we also know how to do that even before birth during our village prenatal visits with all of the other birthing women or women who have given birth who know their own bodies and their own babies and know how to help other mothers. But no, we would never, ever put our hands inside of a woman, ever really, but especially when she's giving birth. And so I think about how warped things have become over the past, 100, maybe 200 years since the advent of so-called modern obstetrics and gynecology, which is a whole thing to get into, the violence of obstetrics and gynecology and the racism of obstetrics and gynecology. But when I think about how warped this sacred moment has become, of one where women are strapped down a lot of the time They're drugged. They have tons of needles and tubes poking out of them. A lot of the time, they stick electrodes into the woman's vagina, into her cervical wall, onto her belly, onto the skull of the baby. And they medicalize and scientificize this natural event that up until the past 100 or so years almost always took place at home in the comfort of your own bedroom or your own space with your partner, generally, hopefully, the man who is going to be the father of your child or children, with your mother or maybe your sister who's already given birth, or a cousin or an auntie or a mother in law, and people who love you and care about you, people who don't interfere with your birthing process but just support you and hold space for you and welcome this new life into the world, and then also take care of you afterwards and take care of your baby afterwards. And so when I look at how warped everything has become and how those precious beginnings of life have been so distorted, to me, it makes complete and total sense as to why the world is the way that it is currently, particularly why Western culture is the way that it is. And so now, after all of that, I can finally begin to understand why, when I asked, what is my path in this life? How can I be of service to humanity? What is my work and what is my deepest healing? I can understand now why motherhood is the most important thing that I can be doing, and preparing for motherhood and moving through that portal and reclaiming my power, because I know that in that work and in that healing, it's not just something that I'm doing for me. It's something that I'm also doing for my mother, Hera. And it's something I'm doing for my grandmother, Marnie. And it's something that I'm doing for my great grandmother, Texas. And for all of the women and mothers in my family, but also in this world, who have had that initiation into motherhood stolen from them. If you've already listened to the episode Midwifing My Elders Through the Portal of Death, Part 1, I talk about a dream that I had where, right before I found out that my grandma had cancer, she came to me in a dream and told me not to be scared of giving birth naturally at home. She told me that she would be there with me. And I know that that is going to be true whenever my time comes. I know that I'm just going to be surrounded by all of the mothers who have come before me. Every single mother in my entire lineage, every single female ancestor that I have is going to be there in the room with me, guiding me through truly one of the most sacred experiences that any human being can have in this life. And so thank God that this is my work in this life. Thank God that I get to do this work for my lineage. Thank God that I get to be the one to help heal and transform so much pain and violence, and to remember what it means to be a mother, what it means to be a creator and giver of life, what it means to be the center of a family's strength, the person that was the portal and the bridge to bring every single being into this new family constellation, to be the one that nurtures that new life, that feeds that sweet little baby with the milk that comes from my breast, to remember that I am the one who knows my child best. I'm the one that knows my family best because they grew inside of me and they came through me. No one delivered them. They delivered themselves. They chose this life. And I held their hand through it.
So to be able to reclaim that for my family, to be able to reclaim the deep, innate understanding that women and mothers carry the seeds of life in our body. We carry the seeds of the future, the seeds of hope, the seeds of change, the seeds of transformation. We carry that inside of us. And we grow that and we nurture that and we create that and we birth that. And that is our innate power, and no one can take that from us ever. To be able to sit in right relationship with that innate truth in my body is the greatest gift that I can offer to this world and to all of my ancestors, and to know that they do it alongside of me. So thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen. I know that my story is certainly not special in that so many of us have gone through birth violence and birth trauma and medical violence, as I touched on at the beginning of this episode. And I pray that in sharing my story, it's opened up some things within you and within your own lineage. For those of you who are subscribed to the Patreon, I'm going to be offering an additional extra episode around my one process of my journey towards motherhood, which there are many, as you can see. I'm sure there's going to be 1,000 and more chapters about learning how birth is actually an altered state of consciousness, and it is in many ways, when it is unmedicated and undisturbed and natural and physiologic, it is a psychedelic experience, one in which birthing mothers are producing the chemical of DMT in the brain and traveling to, altered states of consciousness and different realities and different worlds during their birthing process. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, you can join me over on the Patreon for subscribers, and I'll be sharing more.
Over on the Patreon, I'm also going to be sharing some birth portal prayers that I recorded recently. There are 4 different songs that are all collected together in like a 30-minute long recording. And I recorded all of those for a friend who just gave birth recently, who asked if I could record something to listen to during the birthing process. But I want to share them because, one, I think that they could be supportive for anyone who's giving birth or who is moving through their pregnancy, getting close to that birthing portal. But I also think that it could be really helpful and supportive for people who are maybe dealing with their own birth trauma and would like something to listen to that can help them heal from that. So I don't think that it's just songs for birthing mothers. It's songs about birth, that's for sure, but not ones that I think are exclusive to people who are giving birth. I think that all of us have birth trauma in ways, not just women, but men. So I think this would be a beautiful offering for people to listen to if they're interested in my music. And all of those songs are in English. I usually sing in Spanish, but these songs that came through were all in English. And then for those of you who are subscribed to the Patreon, I share a lot about the inspiration behind the songs to that like first tier of subscribers. So you guys will be able to listen to that. I'll link that in the show notes.
So again, thank you all. Blessings on your health, blessings on your family, and blessings on all of the wombs of your lineage. Thank you so much.